Hey guys, tonight we're following the trail of a man whose ego was as towering as his height was. Well, famously not. You've seen the painting's stiff posture, one hand tucked into his waistcoat, and always that wide, oddly angled hat perched on his head like it's daring someone to knock it off. That hat, worn not front to back like a normal person, but turned sideways like he's headed into battle with the wind. Yes, that hat, the Bicorne. The iconic symbol of Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, and accidental fashion disruptor. You're standing beside him now. Don't worry, he doesn't notice you. You're watching him brush a fleck of dust off the brim. The hat is slightly battered, dark felt, plain in decoration, not too flashy. Napoleon liked it that way. But little do you know, this quiet moment will lead to a low-key fashion war that ripples through courtrooms, bedrooms, and boardrooms, decades after he's gone. You may think a hat's just a hat, but this one, it's practically a character in the saga of European power. It tells people who you are, or who you think you are, or who you wish you could be. And it doesn't take long before everyone starts asking the same whispered question at every military ball and aristocratic garden party. Why is his hat turned like that? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is right now. It's always fun to see who's falling asleep in which time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in late 1700s France. The streets are chaotic. The powdered wigs are still hanging on for dear life, and political heads, literal and figurative, are beginning to roll. But amidst this drama, something curiously understated is taking shape on the heads of military men, the Bicorne hat. And when Napoleon wears it, he turns it sideways, en bataille, as the fashionistas would later note. This style is functional at first. See, if you're a commander and you need to be seen from a distance, a wide, sideways hat silhouette helps. Think of it as pre-radio battlefield branding. You don't want to squint through cannon smoke wondering which tiny man is shouting at you from a hilltop. The sideways hat says, that guy's in charge. But it also says something else, something subtle. It says different. Everyone else is wearing their bicornes en colonne, that is, front to back, like an overgrown football helmet. Napoleon flips the script. He doesn't invent the style, but he owns it like he invented it. Historians still argue whether this was pure practicality or early image strategy. After all, he knew how to craft a myth. Now, let's talk scale. Napoleon had over 100 of these hats made over his lifetime, all in the same style, all from the same Parisian hat maker, Bonaparte et Cie. He didn't like embellishments, no gaudy feathers, no flashy metals, just the black felt, the trim, and the cockade pin in French tricolor. That's it, like Steve Jobs' turtleneck. One look, infinite recognition. And yet, something strange happens. As Napoleon grows in power, so does the hat's mystique. People begin to whisper, is that the hat when he walks by? No one cares about his boots, not his gloves, just the hat. It's like everyone can sense there's something symbolically top-heavy about his entire career. There's even an awkward story, possibly apocryphal, where a Russian diplomat in Paris tried to copy Napoleon's look down to the sideward hat, only to trip on his sword and knock it off into a champagne fountain. The moment was immortalized in at least 3 political cartoons and 1 very drunk opera. And you're sitting nearby in this dreamscape, eavesdropping on hat gossip like it's 1803. You overhear a whisper, his hat has seen more action than half our cavalry. There's a chuckle, but they're not wrong. That hat has ridden through deserts in Egypt, through snow and Austerlitz, through burning cities and board parades alike. It's weathered storms and coups, and it's never once blown away. Magic, no, chin strap. The deeper you go, the more you realize the Bicorne isn't just a fashion choice. It's a mobile metaphor, broad, flat, imposing, and curiously practical for a man so often accused of theatrical ambition. Historians still debate whether his insistence on uniformity, same style, same maker, same size was obsessive-compulsive behavior, or simply a desire to keep his public image airtight. One last quiet observation before we drift onward. Napoleon, despite his legendary stature in history, was not much taller than a modern middle schooler. The hat, in some ways, was his stilts. It added psychological height, a bit of imperial volume, and maybe it was his way of saying, look up to me. And so, there you are, side by side with the emperor on the eve of battle. As he gazes out across a smoky field, the wind picks up, and his coat flaps dramatically. But the hat, it doesn't move, not even a twitch. You blink, and the scene shifts. You're no longer with Napoleon, but centuries earlier, wandering through a royal court where the scent of clove-studded oranges hangs in the air, and the hats are ridiculous. Welcome to the hatscape before the Bicorne. Kings and nobles parade around you like peacocks with hat-based insecurities. There's a man with a feather plume taller than a toddler. Another wears a velvet monstrosity so wide he has to turn sideways to walk through a doorway. You try not to laugh, but the temptation is real. Throughout history, hats weren't just accessories, they were proclamations. A hat could say, I own land, I read Latin, or I once shook hands with someone who met the Pope. Pharaohs had towering headdresses shaped like cones or crowns. Babylonians wore tightly wrapped turbans with gems sewn in, and Mongol Khans sported fur-capped helmets that could probably double as soup pots. In Europe, medieval and Renaissance elites treated their heads like stages. There was the hennin, that conical hat worn by noblewomen that looked suspiciously like something a unicorn would wear. Or the chaperone, which began as a hood and evolved into a hat so elaborate it needed an instruction manual. And then powdered wigs. Imagine having a fake hair hat that doubled as a flea hotel. During the 17th and early 18th centuries, wigs became symbols of authority, health, ironically, and wealth. No one dared go bald publicly unless they were a philosopher or a sailor. The higher and puffier the wig, the better. The King of France, Louis XIV, practically invented a new economy just to support wig makers. Your scalp itches just looking at him. But here's the twist. All of these styles, crowns, helmets, turbans, wigs shared one goal, vertical dominance. The taller, the better. Hats said, look up, I'm above you. It's ironic. Then, that the Bicorne, with its flat batwing shape, decided to go horizontal. Instead of pointing to the sky, it sliced across it like a loaf of dark bread. Historians still argue whether this was fashion rebellion or functional genius. By the time the tricorn came into fashion, the predecessor to the bicorn men had already begun reducing height in favor of width. It was easier to store, easier to remove with a bow, and easier to keep steady in battle winds. The tricorn, with its three corners and snappy fold, ruled the 1700s like the fedora of its age. Then, slowly, the corners folded further inward. Enter the bicorn, a hat with 2 points, less dramatic, more practical, and, unlike the flamboyant styles before it, the bicorn didn't scream for attention, it whispered authority. That subtle curve over the ears, that wasn't just design, it was psychology. And now, you're back in the late 1700s, strolling through a French officer's uniform room. Rows of bicorns hang neatly on pegs like sleeping bats. You lift one, it's lighter than you expect. Stiffened wool, maybe some silk trim. Not flashy, not loud, just serious. Military minds appreciated that. The bicorn became synonymous with strategy, discipline, and pragmatism. You didn't need feathers to command respect, you just needed precision. And Napoleon. He took one look at the hat and said, yes, but let's turn it sideways. But before we join him again, look around. You're seeing the last gasp of old world hat drama, the era when kings were crowned with 3 pounds of gold, and bishops wore hats shaped like upturned fish mouths. The bicorn is coming, and it will flatten the skyline of European headwear. Literally. There's a soldier nearby. You see him adjusting his newly issued bicorne. He mutters, "Looks like a saddle on my forehead." You nod. It does. But little does he know, he's putting on the future. Within a few decades, nearly every military man in Europe will wear some version of it, some vertical, some sideways, and all of them locked in quiet combat over which way is the right way. A quick aside, one particularly cranky Austrian general reportedly banned his officers from turning their bicorns sideways, calling the style Napoleon's nonsense. He was promptly sketched in a cartoon, riding a pig wearing a backwards hat. So now, as you wander through time with hat after ridiculous hat trailing behind you, remember before Napoleon's sleek little bicorne made its sideways debut, the heads of history were stuffed with powdered ambition, vertical bravado, and feathers that could scratch the ceiling. And isn't it funny, for all the jewels and gold they piled onto their heads, none of those monarchs could match the power of one small man in a plain, sideways hat. You're standing in a French tailor's shop in the late 1780s. The air smells like pressed wool and candle wax. Outside, revolution brews. Inside, fashion adjusts quietly, cautiously. Men in uniform stroll past you in coats that still cling to the last ruffles of rococo. But on their heads, a change is taking shape. This is where you witness the rise of the bicorne. It starts as a practical tweak. Officers begin folding down the third point of the popular tricorne hat. The third flap, they realize, just gets in the way, especially when you're riding, or issuing orders, or surviving a cannonball. By folding the front corner backward, they reduce bulk and improve visibility. Suddenly, the bicorne, literally two-horned, is born. Now, you walk the gravel paths of a French military academy. Recruits line up, each with the new hat perched above their temples like a pair of folded bat wings. Their instructors bark about formations and honor, but all you can focus on is the strange uniformity of these headpieces. There's something hypnotic about them. The bicorne doesn't demand attention. Like a crown, it creates cohesion. Historians still argue whether the shift to the bicorne was an official military mandate or a slow cultural creep, like the rise of khakis in your own closet. Some say it emerged from practicality. Others claim it was a quiet rebellion against aristocratic pomp. Either way, the bicorne spread like sleep in a warm room, softly, steadily, and with no intention of leaving. But here's the twist. The direction of the hat was still up for debate. You watch as some officers wear theirs en colonne, facing front to back. The traditional way. It makes the head look long, noble, slightly absurd. Others begin wearing theirs en bataille, side to side, like an open butterfly. That shift, simple as it seems, changes everything. Picture this. You're on horseback, trotting into battle. Wearing the bicorne front to back means your silhouette is slim, side to side. You suddenly look broader, more imposing, almost like a banner. Napoleon would later realize this effect and lean into it like a branding expert. But we're not there yet. You stroll through a hall of mirrors, literally. Versailles. The revolution hasn't reached its full crescendo, but whispers fill the chandeliers. Noblemen stare at their reflections, adjusting bicorns with uncertain hands. One man frowns, muttering, "It makes my head look flat." Another counters, "It makes mine look decisive." You resist the urge to chime in, but silently, you agree with both. And then there's the problem of storage. A front-to-back bicorne slips neatly under your arm. A sideways one, it pokes the person beside you in the ribs. Hat boxes need redesigning. Carriage shelves are reconsidered. You're witnessing the fashion logistics of empire. Back in the tailor's shop, a young man enters nervous, fresh-faced, uniform too large. The tailor hands him a bicorne. "Try this one," he says. The recruit hesitates, then places it sideways. There's a pause. He looks taller, sharper, almost important. The tailor raises an eyebrow. That works. And just like that, You realize something: fashion doesn't always start with declarations. Sometimes it starts with a nervous cadet in a quiet room, trying something new. Oh, and one final detail. While the Bicorne was catching on in France, it was also creeping across Europe. In Spain, Prussia, and even the Ottoman Empire, military uniforms began simplifying: less fluff, more structure, and on many heads. The Bicorne appeared, worn differently, styled with local flair, but unmistakably there. A quiet, unspoken club of flat-headed officers was forming across a continent on fire. So, as you walk back out into the smoky, cobbled streets of pre-revolutionary Paris, try not to trip over the future. It's flat, dark, and slightly tilted to the left. You're now standing just behind a low hill, the smell of powder hanging in the dawn air. Across the field, infantry lines shift like restless shadows. And just ahead of you, Napoleon Bonaparte sits astride his horse, still as a marble statue. But your eyes aren't on the horse, they're on the hat. This is it, the moment he chooses a side, literally. Everyone else, from sergeants to marshals, still wears their Bicorne en colonne, that is. The brim runs front to back, like a pointy canoe slicing through the air. It's fine, it works. No one questions it. But Napoleon, he flips it, and bataille, sideways. The wings of the hat now stretch ear to ear. It makes him look wider, broader. It exaggerates his silhouette against the horizon like a military scarecrow with a plan. You watch him shift slightly in the saddle. There's a pause. Soldiers catch sight of the silhouette. And just like that, the hat becomes a flag. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious image crafting decision or just Napoleon being Napoleon, stubborn, distinct, aware of every glance. But most agree this choice wasn't random. He knew optics, he knew crowd psychology, he knew what made men follow. You step closer, his hat is battered, the felt slightly creased. It's not new. He likes it that way. Weathered hats make him look battle-hardened. Even his valet is under strict orders never to brush them too clean. Legend has it, he'd wear the same hat for weeks at a time, until it gained the perfect "I've conquered 2 nations before breakfast" look. He had over 120 of these hats made in his lifetime, nearly all identical, black felt, no plumes, the same curve, same dimensions, all crafted by the same hat maker in Paris, Poupard, et Scie. Each came with a wooden carrying case, trimmed in green silk, because even conquerors like tidy storage. And what about the cockade, that little round badge pinned to the hat's side? It wasn't just decoration. That rosette of fabric held deep symbolism. Napoleon wore the tricolor blue, white, and red of the French Revolution. Even after crowning himself emperor, he clung to those colors, a strange marriage of old power and new ideals, stitched into 3 tidy layers. You pass other generals now, some adjusting their own hats nervously. One frowns at his mirror. "Should I wear mine sideways too?" he mutters. His aide shrugs. "If you want people to notice." And so it spreads, not by decree, not by regulation, but by imitation. First, Napoleon, then his marshals, then the fashionably ambitious. The Bicorne turned sideways becomes shorthand for "I've seen action," or "I want you to think I have." Soon, satirical pamphlets mock officers who still wear their hats the old way. One famous drawing shows a general with a front-to-back Bicorne standing next to Napoleon, his hat morphing into a dunce cap. Another features an officer with a sideways hat so wide, it knocks over vases at a state dinner. The subtext is clear: fashion, even in war, doesn't wait for policy. You stroll through the Tuileries Palace garden as word of Napoleon's sideways habit spreads through Paris. Shopkeepers start stocking new hat stands designed to hold en bataille bicornes. Artists adjust their portraits. Tailors modify jacket collars to complement the hat's widened profile. And quietly, a few royalists scoff. It looks like a bird trying to fly off his head. One sneers, but even they feel the pressure. The sideways hat is magnetic. It draws attention, and in Napoleon's world, attention equals power. Now let's slow down for one deliciously niche fact. In 1807, at the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon met with Tsar Alexander I. The Russian was over 6 feet tall, with a majestic stovepipe hat that added another half-foot. Napoleon, not amused, allegedly adjusted his bicorne ever so slightly higher before stepping onto the negotiating platform. Just a little upward tilt to balance the scale. So here you are, in a world slowly tilting sideways. Not from politics or battle plans, but from a hat. A simple shift in brim direction that ripples through the empire like spilled ink. It starts as preference, then becomes a symbol, then a standard, and finally, a legacy. You watch Napoleon ride off again, his bicorne, a black wing on either side of his head, slicing through fog like punctuation on a victory. You're ankle deep in mud now, boots squishing as you trudge through a battlefield that smells like horses, smoke, and too much ambition. Cannons thunder in the distance, banners flap in the wind, and above it all, poking through the haze, are the unmistakable shapes of Bicorne hats. Not all are worn like Napoleon's, of course, but the ones that are seem to shimmer with extra authority. You look around, trying to make sense of this bizarre hatscape. Officers bellow orders while dramatically pointing swords. The angle of their hats catches the light. Is it intentional? Oh yes. Bicorne hats are not just headwear anymore. They're directional signals, visual cues, and ego amplifiers rolled into one felt package. Some generals tilt them backward to appear taller. Others pin them lower, almost over their eyebrows, to look brooding and war-wise. One man even wears his at a diagonal, no one knows why, but it makes him look like he's constantly in a duel. The battlefield is becoming a catwalk, and the soldiers, they're the unwilling audience. Historians still argue whether the hat's visibility on the field offered any tactical benefit, or if it just helped soldiers identify which silhouette to follow. There's the wide one, someone might yell. That's our guy. Of course, it also made you a perfect target for enemy sharpshooters, but hey, fashion has its price. You overhear one grizzled veteran muttering, "I don't trust a man unless I can see his hat from 50 paces. He's not joking. And then there are the signals. Napoleon, always one to blend function with flair, reportedly used subtle hat movements as part of his command language. A lift to the left might mean shift the line. A tap to the brim, send in the reserves. This is the stuff of battlefield legend, of course. But it's delicious to imagine, like a hat-based Morse code played out in felt and nerve. Elsewhere, other armies catch on. In Prussia, commanders try sideways hats, but the look doesn't catch on as strongly. The Russians experiment with square-cornered versions that resemble small rooftops. The British, famously stubborn, stick to their own headgear traditions, namely the shako, which looks like an angry stovepipe in search of a bakery. One British officer supposedly declared, "The French may win battles with their hats, but we shall win ours with discipline and tea." He was wrong on both counts that day. Now, walk with me into a field hospital tent just after battle. Amid groans and clinking tools, a bloodied soldier clutches a tattered bicorne like it's a relic. "He dropped this," the man whispers, eyes wide. "Marshal Ney. This is his..." He strokes it like a lucky charm. Maybe some of his courage stuck to it. You don't have the heart to correct him. Let him dream. Outside the tent, the sun is setting. The battlefield quiets. Officers gather in small clusters, comparing wounds, victories, and yes, hat angles. One tries to replicate Napoleon's exact tilt using a mirror and a tree branch. Another gripes, "Every time I wear it sideways, my wife says I look like a broken saddle." And then there's the gossip. Word spreads that one general ordered his tailor to redesign the hat brim to be even broader than Napoleon's. For recognition, he claimed, no one was fooled. It was a bicorne arms race. Bigger, bolder, brow furrowier. Meanwhile, in Paris, caricatures begin to pop up pamphlets showing generals with hats so wide they need 2 aides to carry them. One sketch famously depicted Napoleon's hat as the shadow looming over Europe, literally blanketing the map with its silhouette. The Bicorne had become more than uniform. It was personality. Back on the battlefield, as the smoke clears, you spot something poignant. A fallen officer lies still. His sword rests beside him, but his bicorne. It's perched upright on a rock, wind fluttering the edge. Someone placed it there, like a quiet monument. Because in this world, when you fall, the hat tells your story. You're walking now not through mud or smoke, but across plush carpet beneath glittering chandeliers. Welcome to Paris. 1815. The war is over. Napoleon has fallen. Twice. And now, something utterly ridiculous is happening. You're in the middle of a hat frenzy. Post-Waterloo France is broke, bitter, and bursting with curiosity. The man who once dominated Europe is in exile on a lonely rock in the Atlantic. But back in Paris, his legacy is alive, and it's wearable. The city's auction houses, antique markets, and high society salons are obsessed with one thing: Napoleon's hat, not his strategies, not his letters, just the hat, preferably used, preferably a little smudged, ideally one that had seen battle or at least been near someone who said it had. Historians still argue how many of Napoleon's real bicorns survive, some say fewer than 20. But in the summer after Waterloo, suddenly everyone and their grandfather claims to own one. You stroll past a woman in lavender lace clutching a dusty black hat like it's sacred. He wore it at Austerlitz, she whispers to her companion. Or maybe Dresden. Either way, I felt it. Across the room, a portly man with a monocle waves his paddle frantically. He's bidding on what might be a genuine Napoleonic campaign hat, though the seller admits it was reconstructed after the brim was eaten by mice. The crowd gasps anyway, sold for the price of a small vineyard. Soon, the market floods with bicorns, hundreds of them, thousands, all claiming authenticity. Some come with notes from dubious great-uncles. Others are found mysteriously in trunks beneath family chateaux. The Paris elite is addicted, and the hat makers, they're having a moment. One famous dealer lets call him Auguste, because why not allegedly painted wine stains onto the inner lining of hats to simulate field use? Authentic. He'd nod. See the Merlot at the edge, clearly from Napoleon's night at Wagram. No one questioned it. Even the English catch on. You stroll through London now, past windows where Napoleon-themed souvenirs are everywhere. Biscuit tins shaped like bicorns, umbrellas with brim-shaped handles. One store sells Napoleon's favorite hair oil spoiler. He was balding and probably didn't have a favorite. But the crown jewel, a real or realish Napoleonic hat, goes up for auction in London. The press flocks, lords argue, and when it sells for an absurd sum, the buyer carries it home like a newborn. There's even a rumor, likely apocryphal, that a former mistress of a Napoleonic officer used one of his discarded bicorns to serve cheese at garden parties. The emperor would have approved, she supposedly said, of both the hat and the brie. The obsession isn't just about collecting, it's about identity. Men want to own a piece of greatness. Women want to touch the myth. Children run around with paper versions, pretending to conquer the living room. You pass a cafe where two scholars debate heatedly. Was Napoleon's head actually large? Or did he just like tight-fitting hats? Another replies, he had to anchor the weight of destiny somehow. It's silly. It's sentimental, but also strangely human. After years of bloodshed and revolution, people want something tangible to hold on to. And hats. Hats are tangible. In this world, relics aren't just bones or swords. They're felt, with a little sweat in the band and a crooked brim that says, yes, I was there. And you, dear wanderer, are now an accidental collector yourself. A boy offers you a hat torn at the corner, a red ribbon tucked inside. 10 francs, he says. You buy it, not because it's real, but because for one moment, it feels like it could be. You're now wandering through a narrow Parisian alley that smells faintly of burnt wax and ink. Signs hang crooked over shop doors, chapelier, objets, rares, souvenirs de l'Empire. Behind these doors, a peculiar cottage industry thrives the age of the replica Bicorne. Hat makers are everywhere. Their hands are stained with dye, their windows fogged from steaming felt. You peer inside one workshop and see a craftsman carefully stitching the tricolor cockade onto a fresh hat. He hums a march tune as he works, occasionally glancing at an old sketch of Napoleon tacked to the wall like it's holy reference material. Welcome to the great replica boom. After Waterloo, demand didn't just spike, it exploded. People wanted a hat, any hat. If it couldn't be Napoleon's original, then a replica would do just fine. And so, Paris hat makers pivot. Business is slow for aristocratic foppery now, so why not build empires of felt instead? You stroll past rows of half-finished bicorns stacked like sleeping birds. One artisan boasts that his field-worn series includes hats pre-aged with ash and oil, just as they might have smelled after Marengo. You hold one up, it smells like fireplace and pepper. Close enough. Historians still debate how many of these replicas were passed off as real. Some were honest fakes clearly marketed as tributes. Others, a little more creative. A few shops began printing certificates of authenticity, complete with wax seals, claiming their hats were direct descendants of those worn by the emperor himself. Yes, apparently, hats could reproduce now. One workshop becomes infamous for selling battle-dented bicorns that had simply been slammed in drawers. They'd advertise things like genuine saber slice, 1809. Buyers loved it. People wanted the illusion of chaos. Then came the custom orders. You overhear a dandy request a bicorn with a slightly higher left wing to suggest moral superiority. Another woman wants one with Austerlitz confidence, but not so aggressive. Hat makers oblige. The bicorn had become performance art. And it doesn't stop at headwear. You pass by a bizarre boutique that sells entire outfits designed around the hat. Capes, boots, gloves, all Empire-inspired. One mannequin even has a small compartment built into the chest, labeled for dramatic hand placement. You nod in admiration. That's commitment. In the cafes, hat owners begin meeting like secret societies. They exchange tips on angle, polish, and the correct degree of smugness. There's even a short-lived Journal de Chapeau, where readers submit illustrations of their latest bicorn styles and commentary on brim theory. One letter reads, "Dear Editor, should I arch mine slightly forward to suggest vigilance?" But not everyone's impressed. A pamphlet appears, anonymously printed, titled The Great Hat Lie. It claims that 90% of all bicorns sold since 1815 are fakes, and that Napoleon himself would weep to see his legacy sold as costume. The public ignores it. The next day, someone buys the original pamphlet's cover art and turns it into a limited edition hatband. You step into one last shop, tucked beneath a staircase. The old man inside is silent, careful. His hats are simple, unadorned, elegant. You ask if he's a replica man too. He shakes his head. "These are not Napoleon's hats," he whispers. "They are memories of Napoleon." You don't know exactly what that means, but you buy one anyway. Because here, in the echo of empire, sometimes it's not about wearing his hat, it's about wearing the idea of him. You now find yourself in a grand drawing room, ornate wallpaper, crystal decanters, velvet upholstery that seems to muffle sound itself. But what catches your eye are the men gathered near the fireplace. They look like variations of one another's strong noses, sharp cheekbones, and yes, every single one of them is wearing a bicorn. Meet Napoleon's extended family, and every one of them seems to think they're the next big thing. There's Lucian, his politically savvy brother, fond of broad philosophical declarations and even broader hat brims. Over in the corner is Jerome, the youngest sibling, dramatically adjusting his bicorn at a party like it's a crown. And let's not forget Joseph, the older brother who once declared himself King of Spain and wore his hat like he was rehearsing for an opera. It's a strange scene, a fashion echo chamber of ambition, ego, and inherited hat logic. You step closer and realize they're all wearing their Bicornes en bataille, just like the original. Of course they are. It's more than a trend now, it's a family uniform. To wear it any other way would be sacrilege, or worse, irrelevant. You overhear Lucian complaining that his portraitist didn't quite capture the angle of his bicorne. It needs to look intentional, not accidental. He huffs. Jerome adds, "Mine should say future emperor, not bad posture." Their cousin raises a glass, chuckling. "Well, at least yours doesn't look like it's running away from your face." Historians still argue whether Napoleon's relatives wore the hat as sincere homage, savvy branding, or just good old-fashioned sibling rivalry. But one thing is certain, they all copied his style. Some even kept valets whose sole job was to maintain the hat's stiffness and silhouette. It becomes comical. In one family portrait, no fewer than 5 Bonapartes sit sternly, all with hats angled nearly identically. You half expect one to blink and say, "We were told there'd be cake." Then, a twist the next generation. Nephews, sons-in-law, even distant cousins start entering politics, and the military wearing the signature look. You walk past a military parade in Milan, where one Bonaparte descendant salutes the crowd, and the crowd salutes the hat. It's like a living meme. But not all reactions are positive. A few critics call it Bonaparte cosplay. One Paris satirist publishes a cartoon titled The Battle of the Hats, where each brother's headgear gets progressively taller until one floats away on a balloon. Others are more cynical. "It's just a costume," says one courtier. "The hat carries more power than the head beneath it." A biting remark, yet in many ways true. You stroll through a dusty provincial museum now, where mannequins stand frozen in old Bonapartist uniforms. One case contains a particularly wide-brimmed bicorne labeled allegedly worn by Jerome during a failed march into Prussia, also briefly used as a soup ladle. And here's a fringe fact. There's evidence that Napoleon's niece, Charlotte, once had a dress specially tailored with a neckline inspired by the curve of the bicorne. She wore it at a salon in Vienna. Eyewitnesses said it intimidated and charmed in equal measure. So, as you leave this room of bloodlines and brims, consider this in a world without Napoleon. His family tried to keep his silhouette alive, not through statues, not through speeches. Through hats. You find yourself in a candlelit salon, velvet curtains drawn tight, the clink of porcelain teacups echoing softly, and the air thick with perfume and powder. But the real tension tonight, it isn't politics, it's hats. Across the room, a duchess lowers her lorgnette and sighs dramatically. Another bicorne. Her circle of powdered aristocrats nod gravely, as if someone's just walked in wearing a live goose. The wearer, a young, cocky noble, aligned with the Bonapartist's hat turned sideways. Of course. This dear sleeper is the start of the royal backlash, the slow, stylish revolt against Napoleon's sideways crown. You're watching as monarchists across Europe decide they've had enough. Enough felt, enough flared brims, enough people whispering. He looks like Napoleon, with either admiration or dread. Their counterattack hat reform. Enter the stovepipe hat, tall, straight, rigid, the complete opposite of the soft, sweeping bicorne, popularized first in Britain and quickly adopted by monarchist-aligned aristocrats across the continent. It becomes more than a style, it's a statement. You observe as noblemen in Vienna adopt stovepipes to visually signal restoration. "We're going up," they say with their hats, not sideways. It's the equivalent of shouting "Long live the king," but with millinery. Historians still argue whether the stovepipe hat was truly born as a fashion rebellion against the bicorne, or just happened to rise in parallel, fueled by industrial precision and Abraham Lincoln's eventual endorsement. Either way, the timing is suspiciously symbolic. Even uniforms begin to reflect the split. French émigrés and royal armies switched to tall shakos or helmet-style headgear, anything to avoid being mistaken for a Bonapartist. A royalist commander is said to have barked at a subordinate, "Turn that hat back, or turn yourself out of this regiment." You now walk the cobbled streets of post-Napoleonic Brussels. Street artists are sketching cartoons of people with conflicted hats, bicorns on one side, stovepipes on the other, like split personalities. One caption reads, "To restore or rebel, why not both?" Even the ladies get involved. You pass by a seamstress's shop window, where bonnets shaped vaguely like stovepipes are the new rage. Stiff lace replaces soft ribbon. Regal, one customer declares, and immune to rain. Another adds, "At least I won't be mistaken for a general." At court balls, hat shape becomes the ultimate political cue. A narrow brim, probably a monarchist, wide and soft, likely a Bonaparte sympathizer. One scandal erupts when a lady's feathered fascinator droops leftward, sparking rumors she's hiding a tricolor pin beneath it. There's even a secret society in Berlin, the Order of the Vertical Crown, that requires all members to renounce horizontal headwear as a symbol of disorder. Their initiation, burning a miniature bicorn in a porcelain dish while sipping bitter cherry wine. You chuckle. Fashion, it seems, is the most polite form of war. And let's not forget the clergy. You wander through a churchyard where even bishops begin altering their mitres to stand taller, stiffening the curves, elongating the spires. God, one sermon suggests, prefers vertical alignment. It all builds to a curious little duel in Prague. Two aristocrats, both of noble blood, argue over the hat worn at a funeral. One calls the other a felted Republican, a slap, a challenge, pistols. Neither is hurt, but both hats are forever banned from the chapel. So here you are, drifting through a world of quiet rebellion. No marching armies, just brims and crowns, slants and spikes. Because after all, when the empire ends and the dust settles, what's left? Just the silhouette of your hat. You're standing now in a cramped Parisian print shop, the smell of ink sharp in your nostrils and stacks of fresh paper steaming gently by the windows. There's laughter here, low and clever, the kind that follows a sharp sketch. And on every sheet, hats. Ridiculous hats. Welcome to the golden age of political caricature. And Napoleon's bicorn, it's the star of the show. Artists across Europe are seizing the moment. With the emperor in exile and the world picking at the crumbs of his reign, satirists sharpen their quills, but instead of going straight for the man, they target the hat. It's safer, and somehow, funnier. You look down at one cartoon, Napoleon's bicorn is the entire horse he's riding. His tiny body bobs atop it like a cherry on a cake. The caption reads, "He carries the weight of his ambition, mostly in felt." Another print shows the hat sitting alone on a throne, while a dozen politicians bow before it. One figure mutters, "The head was optional." A third, even crueler sketch depicts the bicorn as a dark cloud reigning over Europe, lightning bolts shaped like bayonets crashing into tiny villages. Historians still debate whether the public laughed at the hat because they feared Napoleon or because it was the only way to stop fearing him. Either way, the hat became a tool for ridicule, for nostalgia, for satire. And artists weren't the only ones. Writers got in on it too. In one serialized romance novel, a daring soldier woos a noblewoman by rescuing her bonnet from a runaway bicorn during a parade. The moment is played with all the high drama of Shakespeare and the silliness of slapstick. Readers love it. The hat becomes shorthand for ego, chaos, and misplaced masculinity. Even children's books pick up the trend. One particularly popular tale features a grumpy, hat-wearing goose named General Napoleon. The bicorn covers his eyes so he constantly walks into ponds. He learns humility after losing the hat to a duck with better posture. You pass through a gallery now low lit. walls crammed with framed satire. The hats here don't sit on heads anymore. They are the characters. One grows legs and chases bankers down the street. Another inflates like a balloon and floats off into space. It's surreal, clever, oddly movingly. And the public eats it up. You pass by a street performer mimicking Napoleon by balancing an absurdly large paper bicorne on his head. He waddles, puffs his chest, and scolds pigeons. The crowd roars. A child throws a coin into his boot. It's not just mockery, it's mythology. These exaggerated hats carry more weight than the real one ever did. Back in the print shop, you notice something curious. One artist is carefully sketching a bicorne on its own, resting on a battlefield with tiny flowers growing out of it. No people, just silence. You ask what it means. He smiles and replies, "Sometimes a hat is just a hat, and sometimes it's everything a man wanted to be." That stays with you. Because as silly as it all seems, the jokes, the giant brims, the leggy hats marching through drawings, there's something deeply human in it. To laugh at power, to reduce a conqueror to a cartoon, to find, in the curves of felt, the absurdity of ambition. And so you walk out into the dusk, Paris glowing in amber light, the cobblestones echoing with distant chuckles. The shadow of a bicorne lingers on every wall. But here, for once, it's not feared, it's smiled at. Now you're seated in a cozy Paris salon where the fire crackles, the teacups clink, and something unusual is happening with the ladies' fashion. No longer content to let the men have all the fun, or all the felt women across Europe are launching their own gentle rebellion. And it starts with one daring decision: they steal the bicorne and twist it into something fabulous. You glance across the room and spot a bonnet it has the faint curves of a bicorne, but with lace, ribbon, and a tilt that's less Marshal of France and more provocateur of afternoon tea. The lady wearing it sips her tea like nothing's amiss. But her eyes, they twinkle with quiet mischief. Welcome to the Bonnet Rebellion. It begins innocently enough. A few fashionable Parisiennes grow tired of the same pillbox and feather arrangements. They want bold lines, strong shapes, something that says, "I read Rousseau but also own 3 lapdogs." And what better inspiration than the iconic hat that once terrified monarchies? Historians still argue whether this trend was political or purely aesthetic. Some say women used bicorne-inspired designs to subtly signal revolutionary sympathies or admiration for Napoleon's meritocratic rise. Others claim it was just about balance. Those wide brims did wonders for certain face shapes. You pass through a milliner's shop, where half the display bonnets are labeled with names like La Petite Bataille or Madame Marengo. One even has tiny embroidery along the brim that reads, "Power is flattering." Some salons embrace the trend entirely. At one notorious gathering, women compete to see whose hat most resembles a famous Bonaparte campaign. A countess wins by inserting tiny gold cannons into her trim. Waterloo. Darling, she purrs, but with curls. Not everyone is amused. A letter from an irate nobleman appears in the Gazette de la Mode, calling the bonnet bicorne fusion an insult to respectable femininity. His wife is later seen wearing a hybrid creation with a satin cockade. Coincidence? Probably not. You listen in as 2 debutantes discuss their battle bonnets. One boasts, "Mine's shaped after Austerlitz." The other replies, "I prefer Jena. It sits better in the wind." You quietly wonder if these are real engagements or just stylish code for who had the best tailor. And yes, the satire catches up. Caricatures flood the streets showing women in bonnets so wide they knock over bookshelves. One infamous image shows a couple kissing, their bicorne-inspired bonnets smacking together like cymbals. Meanwhile, designers in Vienna, Madrid, and Milan begin exporting the trend under clever names like La Victoire Féminine or Dame de Guerre. By the time it reaches London, it's watered down into decorative headbands called empire arcs, but the soul is still there. Even children's clothes join in. You spot a toddler wobbling past in a soft bonnet shaped like a tiny general's cap. His nanny coos, "Mon petit conquérant." You raise a brow. The kid sneezes. Back at the salon, one woman lifts her bonnet and reveals a hidden message stitched inside. "I'd rather be bold than boring." The other ladies cheer softly, as if they've just read Voltaire aloud in a church. It's a strange, delightful rebellion. No speeches, no protests, just fashion with an edge of irony. Women rewriting the rules of who wears what and why. And so, you sit back, teacup warm in your hand, as the fire flickers and the ladies laugh sideways hats, casting dramatic shadows on the wallpaper. A silent revolution, stitched in silk. You're on the move again this time, crossing the open training fields of 19th century Europe. Dust kicks up behind marching boots. Horns blare in awkward unison. And above every head, hats bob like punctuation marks in an enormous multi-country sentence. But look closely, these aren't just fashion statements. They're ideological declarations. Welcome to the Uniform Wars, where nations fight not only with muskets, but with millinery. It starts in France, naturally, where the bicorne becomes more than Napoleon's hat, it becomes France's hat. Even after his fall, French officers cling to it, tradition, honor, and a bit of superstition all blend together like weak coffee. A sideways hat means business. One general reportedly mutters, "A forward hat means business is over." You walk beside a row of cadets at Saint Cyr Military Academy. Their uniforms are crisp, their hats, of course, worn en bataille. It's a school of precision, but also a museum of memory. Every tilt of the brim says, "We still remember who taught us how to march." Then you cross the border into Prussia. Prussia, land of discipline, starch, and hats that look like armored chimneys. The bicorne made a brief appearance here, mostly for ceremonial use, but it never quite caught on. It wasn't intimidating enough. Instead, they chose the Pickelhaube, a helmet with a shiny spike that says, "I will impale your sarcasm." Historians still argue whether the Pickelhaube was a fashion choice or an overcorrection. But one thing is clear, France went broad and curved. Prussia went tall and pointy. Somewhere, a tailor weeps. Over in Britain, you watch the redcoats parade by in their stiff shakos. Tall, narrow, straight. The British military rejects the bicorne for regular use, preferring sharp vertical lines and flat, sober statements. "We don't do sideways," a colonel says with finality, adjusting his monocle. It's very French. That doesn't mean they ignore it, though. British satire thrives on poking fun at French uniforms. One play, The March of the Milliners, features a French general whose hat grows every time he loses a battle. Audiences howl. Napoleon becomes a fashion punchline, but also a style icon. British officers still get their portraits painted with hats almost like his, just different enough to avoid scandal. Meanwhile, in Austria, the bicorne sticks around ceremonial, somber, proud. Officers in the Habsburg court keep them for court dress, and in military portraits, the sideways hat lingers like a stubborn cousin. Even into the 1840s, you can spot the occasional Austrian general wearing a bicorne so wide, he has to duck through doorways sideways. And what about outside Europe? In Mexico, French influence during the brief reign of Emperor Maximilian brings a mini bicorne revival, though it competes with wide sombreros in both shade and drama. In Egypt, French advisors bring not just strategy, but uniforms. Some Egyptian officers briefly wear modified bicornes adapted for sun, but undeniably imperial. You now sit in a dusty barracks in Algeria. French colonial troops line up under a blazing sun. Some officers still cling to the bicorne, though the heat makes it impractical. One soldier mutters, "It's like wearing a teapot on your skull." His friend replies, "It's tradition." You both laugh. Then Russia. You walk the snowy training fields outside St. Petersburg. There. The Bicorne has been exiled to the archives. Russian military fashion embraces the bearskin cap and the czarist shako, wide-brimmed French flair. Not welcome here. Too warm. One officer jokes. Too French, says another. And so, you see it clearly the hat is a line in the sand, not just of taste, but of identity. In France, it means honor and history. In Britain, satire and suspicion. In Prussia, impracticality. In Austria, frozen ceremony. Each choice of headwear is loaded with loyalty, memory, and a faint whiff of sweat. The uniform wars rage not on battlefields, but in tailor shops and barracks, quietly, invisibly, and the Bicorne, it's caught in the crossfire. So, you adjust your own imaginary hat now, wondering which nation would have claimed your brim. And with that, the parade continues. Marching toward modernity, one oddly shaped hat at a time. You're stepping into the present day now, or something very close to it. No more battlefields, no salons, no declarations of empire, just a quiet suburban home in Normandy where a man in his 60s adjusts the lighting around a glass display case. Inside, A felt Bicorne, and a hand-labeled placard, possibly worn by a cousin of Napoleon, on Sundays. Welcome to the modern age of Napoleonic obsession, where collectors and cosplayers carry on the great sideways tradition with a mix of reverence, theatricality, and the occasional hot glue gun. You're in a world of reenactment enthusiasts, auction sharks, armchair historians, and Bicorne whisperers. These are people who not only study the past, they dress in it. The collector you just met, he spent 10 years tracking down that hat. Says he felt a spiritual vibration when he first touched the brim. His wife rolls her eyes, but makes sure the spotlight is always angled just right. You move on to a reenactment event, maybe Austerlitz. Maybe just a muddy farm renamed Little Marengo, there, under a cloudless sky. Grown adults in full 19th century garb march, shout, and dramatically faint. And on nearly every head, a Bicorne, black felt, tilted sideways. Some with faded cockades, some with LED lights for effect, don't ask. One man stops you. His name is Gerard. He's 43, works in logistics, and has 5 custom-made Bicornes, each for a different mood. He says, this one is for victories, that one, rain. Historians still debate whether modern Napoleon fandom is more about admiration or escapism. Some reenactors say they're honoring military genius. Others just like the hats. And a few are just really into felt. You pop into a cosplay forum online, there. Arguments rage not over strategy, but brim curve. Your hat is too shallow for 1806. Someone yells in all caps, fix your cockade, placement cries, another. The drama is palpable. Meanwhile, auctions continue, some high-end, some suspiciously vague. One recent sale in Monaco featured a confirmed Napoleonic officer's Bicorne, which later turned out to be made in 1922 for an operetta, still sold for 6 figures. You watch a YouTube video titled Unboxing Napoleon's Hat, the question mark doing a lot of work. A man opens a dusty box, reverently lifts a Bicorne with gloves, and spends 5 minutes just breathing. You can feel the weight of history, he whispers. Commenters below debate whether the felt looks imperial enough. In a dusty bookstore in New York, you overhear 2 enthusiasts comparing storage methods. I keep mine in acid-free paper under a glass dome. I sleep with mine under my bed like Napoleon did. The second guy winks. No one knows if he's joking. You visit a French school play where a child plays Napoleon with a comically oversized foam Bicorne. It flops every time he bows. The parents laugh, then clap a little too loudly. Someone whispers, he looks just like the emperor did, except happier. And then the museums. Ah, the museums. You stand before a sealed glass case at Les Invalides in Paris. There it is, one of the real Bicornes. No LEDs, No glue, no cosplay, just time and fabric. You lean close. The brim is softer than you expect. The color almost brown now, faded by light, not by loss. It feels small, but powerful. And you realize something. This hat, this ordinary, extraordinary object has been worn, mocked, copied, worshipped, mass-produced, and reenacted for over 2 centuries, all because a man wore it sideways. So, as you step out of the museum, blinking in the sun, you see a tourist wearing a baseball cap. He's trying to angle it just so, and you smile. Because maybe the brim wars never really ended. Now you're seated in a dimly lit theater. The velvet seats creak, the projector hums, and on the screen in front of you, Napoleon again. But this time, he's animated, or he's played by an actor who's 6'4", or he's voiced by a gruff New Yorker with suspiciously strong opinions on artillery. Welcome to Napoleon in pop culture, a realm where the man is often misunderstood, but his hat instantly recognized. You've seen it a wide black curve, sometimes with a blue cockade, sometimes floating above a cartoon character's head like a storm cloud. It shows up everywhere from historical dramas to cereal boxes. Let's start with the movies. You watch as actors march across battlefields, bicorns bouncing dramatically. One actor plays Napoleon with a whisper, another with a shout, but all wear the hat. Even when the uniform is inaccurate or the accent wobbles, the hat is there. A shorthand, a symbol, a cinematic requirement. In one silent film from the early 20th century, the hat practically has its own entrance. A slow pan from shoes, to sword, to the hat. The crowd gasps. Even when the actor is too tall, too broad, too not Napoleon, that hat fixes everything. Historians still argue whether these portrayals shaped or shattered public understanding of Napoleon. But what they all agree on, the hat made the man into a brand. You don't need to say Bonaparte anymore. You just draw a bicorne. Now, fast forward to animation. You're watching a 1980s cartoon villain plot world domination. He's short, he's furious. And yes, he's wearing a tiny sideways bicorne. Why, you ask aloud? A child beside you shrugs. Because he's the boss. From Animaniacs to Looney Tunes, the caricature is always the same. Napoleon is a bite-sized tyrant, and the hat is his exclamation mark. No context needed, no backstory required, just that shape. One cereal brand in the 1960s tried launching a campaign with a cartoon general Bicorne Barry, who promised 2 scoops of conquest in every bowl. It didn't last long, but the hat, still remembered? You flip through a comic book now. A time-traveling superhero visits 1805. The artist draws Napoleon's entire silhouette with just 2 lines, boots and bicorne. That's all it takes. Even music videos join in. One indie band performs dressed entirely as different Napoleons: Sad Napoleon, Disco Napoleon, Cowboy Napoleon. The lead singer, of course, wears the biggest hat. They sing march to the beat of your own war drum. Babe, it's catchy and confusing. Then there's fashion. You walk a runway show in Milan figuratively, of course, where one designer revives the bicorne as high art. The models stomp in cloaks, velvet breeches, and hats so wide they need clearance. One model spins, and her hat knocks over a floral arrangement. The crowd applauds. Brava. And yes, cosplay. At conventions worldwide, Napoleonic outfits show up more often than you'd expect. Some are accurate down to the stitching, others are hybrids. Napoleon meets Star Wars, or anime general with bicorne flair. One contestant wears a LED-lit bicorne that blinks in Morse code. It says I came, I saw, I danced. You stroll past a gift shop where plush Napoleons sit beside Eiffel Towers. His hat is oversized, his eyes buttony. Squeeze his belly and he shouts, Mon Empire in a squeaky voice. Children laugh. Somewhere. The real Napoleon rolls in his tomb. But here's the twist: even in satire, even in farce, the hat keeps its weight. It's instantly legible, strangely respected, an icon in the truest sense. Because no matter how you bend or stretch him, shrink him for cartoons or elevate him for film, you always start with that silhouette, that sideways shape, that whisper of history. And as you leave the theater, the end credits roll over a final shot, a lone bicorne resting on a windswept table, fade to black. A symbol, a shadow, a shape you can never quite forget. Now, at last, you arrive on a windswept, lonely island in the middle of the South Atlantic. The sea crashes softly against volcanic rock, gulls circle high, and the wind tugs at your coat with a chill that feels final. Welcome to St. Helena. This is where Napoleon Bonaparte spends his final years exiled, surrounded by British guards, distant ocean, and memory. No glory, no cannon fire, no cheers, just gray skies and the slow rhythm of forgetting. But even here, the hat endures. You follow a narrow path up to Longwood House, the Emperor's last residence. The rooms are sparse, damp, and small. The furniture is modest, but resting carefully, preserved on display behind glass, is one of his last bicorns. And somehow, it says everything. It's faded, a bit moth-eaten, the silk lining has thinned, and the brim curves less defiantly than it once did. But the silhouette, the iconic, sideways sweep, it's still there, still unmistakably his. You lean closer, imagine him pacing in this very room, hat in hand, or maybe perched on a peg. He wore fewer of them in these final years, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps because even legends grow tired. One of Napoleon's valets wrote that the emperor clung to routine, even in exile, dressing precisely, trimming his sideburns, placing his hat just so, as if controlling this one detail might still give him command over something, anything. Historians still debate which of the final bicorns was the last. Some say it's the one with a stain near the brim, coffee or ink. Others believe it's the one gifted to a British officer as a gesture of resignation, peace irony. Over time, several of these hats were smuggled, sold, traded, and displayed. One ended up in a private English estate, another in a museum in New Zealand, and one famously resurfaced at auction over 200 years later, fetching a staggering $1.8 million. Yes, for a hat. You imagine the journey from Napoleon's head to battlefield to exile to a velvet-lined box under a spotlight. It's poetic, it's absurd, it's inevitable. And then, one quiet scene. You're at the edge of Napoleon's tomb in Les Invalides, Paris. Tourists shuffle past, heads bowed, cameras ready, and above the tomb, painted on a mural, embroidered into military banners, printed on every souvenir, the hat. Because in the end, this wasn't just something he wore. It became part of the myth, a helmet of identity, a silent flag, a stubborn silhouette that refused to turn with the times. It never changed, even when everything else did. So now, let your eyes drift closed, let your breath slow, your shoulders sink. The journey has come full circle from windswept battlefields to cluttered auctions, from satire to reverence, from glory to exile, all guided by the quiet curve of a sideways hat. You've followed a felt thread through history, watched empires rise beneath it, and fashion fold itself in its shadow. You've seen generals tilt it just so, artists mock it with gentle ink, and children turn it into paper crowns. It was always more than an accessory. It was declaration, identity, performance, a way to be seen, even when no one was looking. And now, you drift in a space beyond time. You're seated in a quiet museum, or a foggy battlefield, or maybe a candlelit salon filled with silken whispers. The hat rests beside you, no longer a symbol, no longer an argument. Just an object, worn, familiar, soft at the edges. Let it fade now. Let it gently tip forward. like a bow at the end of a long, strange play. The kind that lingers in your mind long after the lights go out. And you've marched enough for one night. Sweet dreams and good night.